Now, more than a month later, no sign of Sebastian, no sign of foul play, and no answers about what happened. We'll take a look at their relationships, legal battles, and tension that could have impacted Sebastian.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello, and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. You may have noticed that the Sebastian ROGERS case, can it even be called a case? I mean, officially, can it be called a case? Is it a case? In any event, it's no longer really in the news, which means the reporting is now sort of happening on social media. The standards for verifying and verifiable information on social media are simply different to the media. How much can you rely on? What's also different, for example, in this long statement by Chris Proudfoot's former wife, Nina Gomez, is that it's an emotional story really about character evidence, and it isn't strictly speaking evidence. And so the question is it relevant?
We had a conversation my mom brought up between Christopher, myself, and her. And she had said, do you not want faith? Do you not want this baby? And Christopher stated to my mom he wasn't happy. And he said, what if one of them dies? What if Faith dies or Nina dies on the...
Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, I think it is relevant, but it's tough to speculate how relevant it might be. In her retrospective, I'll put a link to it in the description, Nina describes her marriage to Chris, who was in the Navy at the time, so he's an ex-military dude. Her moving to San Diego, her falling pregnant, his wanting an abortion, according to her, and then a worsening downward spiral. He comes across, certainly in her version of events, as belligerent at times. She describes Chris disciplining her child, who was just 3 at the time, and several occasions where he seemed to cross parenting lines. Now, the problem with Nina's story is that she has a personal stake in it, and it is, after all, a character sketch from a disenfranchised spouse. Many of us can speak unfavorably about our past relationships we've been in. That doesn't make us innocent and them guilty, or vice versa, let alone anyone a criminal in that particular equation. So this is definitely a gray area, as far as I'm concerned, in true crime. Now, I'm sure if you've been listening to this, it's very hard not to pick a side. It's very hard not to say, I've experienced this, he's the enemy, you know what I mean? What I think is relevant is the sort of the legal milestones, right? So what I think is relevant is if and when CPS were called, if they were called, and then transgressions resulting in calls to the cops. In other words, signs of actual criminality, signs of registered, recorded signs of violence, like when statements were made. In other words, where there's a legal precedent in terms of someone's backstory that is worth focusing on. And so the question is, how much of that is present in this case? That said, listening to admittedly some but not all of Nina's story, I think I only listened to the first 20 minutes or so, it does sound like Chris may not have been the best match to look after a kid with autism. And that was something that I said before hearing all of this information, based on Chris's own words, saying that he's a really strict dad, that he doesn't abide, a kid playing computer games or social media. there does seem to be quite a sort of a military level of discipline there, to put it mildly. But really, the only people who could really confirm, what kind of dad Chris was to Sebastian would be Katie. And Katie is still with Chris. And I guess the other people that could confirm what is going on is Seth and I guess Sebastian. Sebastian's not available, and so let's see what Seth says about Sebastian and his relationship in a way with Chris.
And Sebastian was supposed to come live with me. Chris was working on Katie, on getting her to agree to it, and all I wanted was my son to come live with me.
Wow. Now, I'm not sure if one would call that a twist, but it certainly puts things in a totally different perspective here. This idea that between the two dads, the biological dad and the stepdad, is this effort to have this little boy moved away from his biological mother. And that does seem to indicate that certainly Chris didn't see little Sebastian as his own, didn't really seem to want to deal with this little boy the way a parent should, right? Didn't seem really invested. And there's also a little bit of a parallel to, if Nina's story is to be believed, to another occasion where he's not interested in a relationship with a child. And that sort of thing really does put a kind of a tint on the child then disappearing. If we zoom out of Nina's story, it's a 2-hour long kind of emotional, not diatribe, but certainly story. If you just zoom out of that, what she's really communicating is, I think, a torrid custody battle, something that is kind of going on in the background, dragging on, and that may have pushed Chris to, in terms of stress and anxiety and frustration and all those negative emotions, to breaking point. It may have pushed both Chris and Katie to breaking point. That, you've got this custody battle going on, and we know what it did with Fotis Doulos and Jennifer Doulos and Michelle Troconis. We know that custody battles can be draining and can suck up resources. And so if you have that, and then Sebastian may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. You have that, and then you've also got the amounts of energy you've got to apply to this little child who's growing up and he's got his needs. Are you able to put energy aside to deal with that? So what I'm saying is there's certainly enough emotional dynamite in the relationship dynamics for some sort of explosion within the family setup, for which would be enough to simply rule out an abduction scenario, to make it completely superfluous. On the other hand, I suppose you could also argue that an unsettled and unhappy home front, where a little boy does feel unwanted, could also prompt a little boy to want to run away. At the end of the day, though, Chris does have an alibi, doesn't he? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.